Russian President Boris Yeltsin resigned, leaving Prime Minister Vladimir Putin as acting president. For Russia, the end of 1999 was gloomy with terror attacks, conflict in Chechnya, and continuing aftershocks from the 1998 financial crisis. But the following decade proved better, as Oksana Boyko reports.
Hoping for the best, preparing for the worst. The final days of 1999 filled Russians with anticipation of technical glitches that resulted in a major power switch. As the chimes struck midday, the Kremlin changed as if with a wave of a magic wand.
I'm leaving.
Ухожу раньше.
I'm leaving before my term is over. I understand that it's something I must do.
While at the time some compared Russia's political transformation to the Cinderella plot, Russia's outgoing president was anything but fairy godfather. Widely criticized for his inability to stem both economic decline and his own alcohol addiction, Boris Yeltsin was more of a king who couldn't leave the palace without appointing a successor. And his choice stood the test of time. Vladimir Putin inherited a country where mothers dreaded sending their sons to the army. The conflict in Chechnya had already claimed thousands of lives, turning a once prosperous region into smoking ruins. A decade later, the Chechen capital is one of the most modern cities in Russia, where high heels are now more common than combat boots. The only reminder of the bloodshed is the shortage of available grooms.
There are so many beautiful girls in Grozny, and all they want is to get married. The competition is high, especially because the number of eligible men decreased.
But even with the end of combat in Chechnya, the death toll continued to rise. The past decade was scarred by terror attacks, most of them linked to Chechen terrorists. From the Moscow theater siege to plane bombings, some 800 people lost their lives because of terrorists. But no other tragedy gripped hearts more tightly than the school siege in Beslan. Time hasn't dried Natasha's tears. It has turned her grief into boiling anger. 5 years after Natasha's daughter died in Beslan, she still blames the authorities for her loss.
How did these beasts get to the school? Where did they get their weapons? Why did nobody stand in their way? And who is responsible for creating this cemetery?
While 3 policemen were the only officials charged with negligence in the aftermath of the attack, the country itself underwent large administrative changes. Direct regional elections were abolished, kicking up a process that the Kremlin called reinforcement of power vertical.
Vladimir
Putin used the Beslan tragedy in order to introduce long overdue administrative changes without too much pain for the society. And those changes were necessary because by that time some regions had become so independent, I would even say feudal, that they could undermine the integrity of the entire federation.
While assessment of Russia's political makeover is still a matter of debate, economic changes were more clear-cut. A decade ago, Russia was struggling to pay its debt and was barely able to meet its social obligations. Now the country is a major international donor and its social spending has increased dozens of times. In the meantime, the price of oil had risen almost 5-fold.
Russia's ability to pay back its 1990s debts was in large degree due to rising oil prices. But the devil is in the details. The reason why Western countries were so generous in lending to Russia was because they hoped to get a share of Russia's hydrocarbons. So when they got back just money, they weren't happy. That's why Putin is so often disliked in the West.
Tasting prosperity, toasting to stability. To these Russians, Putin's presidency was an uninterrupted string of rising income and growing opportunities. Most wanted the party to never end, and most saw the newly elected president as a guarantor of better life. Medvedev's honeymoon in office didn't last long. The global financial crisis was already gathering steam when Russia was drawn into its first international conflict in 2 decades. The war in South Ossetia tested not only the country's armed forces, but also its political stamina. For almost a year after the confrontation with Georgia, Russia's contacts with the West remained frozen, only to be back to business as usual in 2009.
I would like to stress the timing of when the war was launched. It happened when neither President Medvedev nor Prime Minister Putin were in Moscow. Medvedev was at a business trip in the Russian regions, and Putin was in Beijing with our athletes at the Olympic Games. There have been numerous attempts to keep check on Russian influence in the post-Soviet space, and I'm sure there will always be.
This New Year Eve, most Russians will have more food on their tables than they had a decade ago, but their expectations will also be higher, something that the country's president will have to live up to.
Убежден, что какие бы трудности не ждали нас в будущем,
I'm convinced that no matter what hardships await us ahead, we will be able to deal with them. The state will do everything necessary for that. Numbers on the calendar will change within a few moments, but what will remain unchanged are the values which form our basis at all times. These are love for our dear ones, love and loyalty, sympathy and charity.
While politicians still argue about gains and losses of the last decade, most agree that, if anything, it's given Russia a chance to pause and count to 10. Oksana Boyko, RT, Moscow.